His own generals wanted him court-martialed for refusing orders. The newspapers called him a coward. But this one American general's rebellion would expose the biggest scandal in the entire Pacific War and save thousands of lives. Summer 1944. The Pacific island of Peleliu. American military planners say it needs to be captured before the invasion of the Philippines. They say it'll take 3 days. Maybe 4. But one Marine general looks at the intelligence and sees something terrifying. This won't take days. It'll take months. And thousands of Marines will die for an island that America doesn't even need. His name is Holland Smith, and what he's about to do will shake the entire American command structure in the Pacific. Holland Smith was born in 1882 in Alabama. He grew up in the South during Reconstruction. His family wasn't wealthy. His father was a lawyer but not a successful one. Smith had to work his way through everything. He went to Auburn University, then got into the Naval Academy at Annapolis. But he didn't want to be a sailor. He wanted to be a Marine. Smith graduated in 1905 and immediately requested assignment to the Marine Corps. Back then, the Marines were a small organization. They weren't the massive force they'd become by World War II. They were mainly used for guarding naval installations and small expeditionary operations. Smith spent his early career in various postings around the world. Philippines, Panama, Dominican Republic, Haiti. Small wars and small actions. But Smith was always thinking about bigger problems. How do you conduct amphibious operations? How do you get troops from ships onto hostile beaches? How do you coordinate naval gunfire with ground attacks? These questions weren't considered important by most military planners in the early 1900s. But Smith was obsessed with them. By the 1930s, Smith was one of the Marine Corps' leading experts on amphibious warfare. He wrote training manuals. He developed tactics. He ran exercises. When World War II started, the Marines needed these skills desperately. The Pacific War would be fought by hopping from island to island. Every operation required amphibious landings. Smith's expertise suddenly became crucial. Smith was given command of Marine forces in the Pacific. By 1944, he was a lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking Marines in the entire Corps. He'd overseen multiple successful amphibious operations. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam. These battles were brutal. The Japanese defended every island fanatically. But Smith's planning and tactics had worked. The islands were captured. The campaign was moving forward. But Smith had also earned a reputation. A bad one in some circles. He was known as Howling Mad Smith because of his temper. He yelled at subordinates. He fired officers he thought were incompetent. He fought constantly with Navy admirals and Army generals over tactics and command authority. Smith made enemies everywhere he went. Some people thought Smith was impossible to work with. A screaming martinet who couldn't cooperate with anyone. But the people who actually served under Smith saw something different. They saw a general who cared intensely about his Marines. Who refused to waste their lives. Who fought against orders he thought were stupid or suicidal. Smith's anger wasn't random. It was directed at people he thought were getting Marines killed unnecessarily. In summer 1944, Smith was shown the plans for the invasion of Peleliu. This was a small island in the Palau chain, about 500 miles east of the Philippines. The island was only about 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. Mostly coral rock with some beaches. The Japanese had a garrison of about 10,000 troops. The operation plan said that the 1st Marine Division would land on Peleliu, secure the airfield, and clear Japanese resistance in 3 or 4 days. Then the island would be used as a base for supporting MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines, which was scheduled for October. Smith read the plan and immediately saw problems. Big problems. He'd studied intelligence reports about Peleliu. The Japanese weren't defending the beaches like they had at earlier islands. They'd learned that American naval gunfire and air strikes destroyed beach defenses. So on Peleliu, the Japanese had moved their main defenses inland. Into caves in the rocky hills that dominated the island's interior. The intelligence showed hundreds of caves. Maybe thousands. all connected by tunnels. The Japanese had spent months fortifying these positions. They had artillery positioned in caves with perfect fields of fire over the landing beaches. They had machine gun nests that could cover every approach. The whole island was one massive fortified position. And the geography was horrible. The hills weren't normal hills. They were jagged coral ridges called the Umerbergol. Sharp as knives. Almost impossible to climb. No vegetation for cover. Just bare rock that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. Attacking into that terrain would be a nightmare. Smith told the planners that 3 days was insane. This operation would take weeks, maybe longer. It would cost thousands of casualties. And he questioned whether Peleliu even needed to be captured. MacArthur's forces were already bypassing Japanese-held islands. Why not bypass Peleliu too? The Japanese garrison couldn't threaten MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines. They were isolated. Let them sit there and rot. The Navy and Army planners dismissed Smith's concerns. They said the intelligence was reliable. That the 1st Marine Division was one of the best units in the Pacific and could handle it. That Peleliu's airfield was necessary for supporting the Philippines invasion. Smith was being too cautious. The operation would proceed as planned. Smith went higher up the chain of command. He contacted Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. He sent detailed reports explaining why the Peleliu operation was badly planned. He argued that the casualty estimates were way too low. That the timeline was unrealistic. That the whole operation should be reconsidered. Nimitz's staff thanked Smith for his input and told him the operation was approved at the highest levels. It couldn't be cancelled now. Too much was already in motion. Ships were loading. Troops were preparing. The date was set for September 15, 1944. Smith needed to stop complaining and do his job. Smith was furious. He knew what was coming. He'd seen enough amphibious operations to recognize when planning was based on wishful thinking rather than reality. Peleliu was going to be a bloodbath. And nobody wanted to listen to him because listening would mean admitting the plan was flawed. So Smith made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He decided he was going to protect his Marines no matter what it took. Even if it meant defying orders. Even if it meant destroying his own career. He wasn't going to sit back and watch thousands of men die because some staff officers in Hawaii didn't want to admit they'd screwed up. The invasion of Peleliu began on September 15, 1944. The 1st Marine Division landed under heavy fire. Just like Smith had predicted, the Japanese weren't defending the beaches in strength. They let the Marines land, then opened fire from the hills with artillery and mortars. The Marines took casualties immediately but pushed inland toward the airfield. By the end of the first day, the Marines had captured the airfield. The operation seemed to be going according to plan. The staff officers back at headquarters were congratulating themselves. See, Smith had been wrong to worry. The Marines were professionals. They were handling it. But Smith knew better. He was monitoring reports from the front lines. The easy part was over. Now the Marines had to clear the Japanese from the Umerbergol ridges. That's where the real fighting would begin. On the second day, Marine units attacked into the ridges. And they ran into a nightmare. The Japanese positions were even stronger than intelligence had reported. Every cave had multiple firing positions. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. The terrain was so rough that tanks couldn't operate. Artillery couldn't hit the cave entrances. Airstrikes were useless against targets hidden inside solid rock. The Marines fought with incredible bravery. They climbed those razor-sharp ridges under fire. They assaulted cave after cave. They used flamethrowers, explosives, grenades, anything they could to clear Japanese positions. But for every cave they cleared, there were 10 more. And Japanese reinforcements moved through the tunnel networks to reoccupy positions the Marines thought they'd secured. By day 3, the day the operation was supposed to be finished, the Marines had barely made a dent in the Japanese defenses. Casualties were mounting. The heat was unbearable, over 100 degrees with no shade. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. Water was running short. Medical supplies were running low. And the Japanese kept fighting from their cave complexes. Smith watched the casualty reports coming in and felt sick. Exactly what he'd predicted was happening. The staff officers, 3 or 4 days, was revealed as fantasy. This operation was going to take weeks. And it was going to destroy the 1st Marine Division. Smith started making decisions that put him in direct conflict with higher command. First, he demanded massive reinforcements. Not just replacements for casualties, but entire additional units. He wanted the 81st Infantry Division, which had been held in reserve, committed to Peleliu immediately. The Navy resisted. They said the 81st was needed for other operations. Smith didn't care. He needed those troops now. Smith went over his immediate superiors and contacted Admiral Halsey directly. He told Halsey that Peleliu was turning into a disaster. That casualties were going to be in the thousands. That he needed the 81st Division or the operation might fail completely. Halsey, who respected Smith even if he didn't always agree with him, authorized the commitment of the 81st Division. But Smith's interference didn't stop there. He started countermanding orders from the landing force commander on Peleliu. The commander, Major General William Rupertus, was one of Smith's subordinates. Rupertus was a by-the-book officer who insisted on following the operation plan even as it was clearly failing. He kept ordering frontal assaults against Japanese positions. He refused to admit the operation was taking longer than planned. He kept sending optimistic reports to headquarters saying the island would be secured soon. Smith knew Rupertus was lying or deluded. The island wouldn't be secured soon. The Marines were being ground down in brutal attritional fighting. Smith started sending his own staff officers to Peleliu to assess the situation independently. These officers reported back that Rupertus was out of touch with reality. That the 1st Marine Division was being destroyed. That something had to change. Smith made the controversial decision to relieve Rupertus of portions of his command authority. He brought in officers from the 81st Division to take over sectors of the island. This was essentially a vote of no confidence in Rupertus. It was also a violation of the chain of command. Smith wasn't supposed to micromanage operations on the ground. He was supposed to let the landing force commander run the battle. But Smith didn't care about procedures. He cared about his Marines. And he could see that Rupertus's rigid adherence to the failed plan was getting men killed. The situation got worse when Smith started publicly criticizing the Peleliu operation. He gave interviews to war correspondents where he said the island didn't need to be captured. That the operation was a waste of lives. That staff officers who'd never been in combat had designed a plan based on fantasy. That the whole Pacific Command structure needed reform. These statements were explosive. Officers didn't publicly criticize ongoing operations. They definitely didn't criticize higher command. Smith was violating every norm of military propriety. His superiors were furious. There was talk of relieving Smith of command. Of court-martialing him for insubordination. But Smith had one thing protecting him. He was right. Everything he'd predicted about Peleliu was coming true. The operation that was supposed to take 3 days was stretching into weeks. Casualties were mounting into the thousands. The 1st Marine Division was being torn apart. And it was becoming clear that Peleliu's airfield wasn't even needed for the Philippines invasion. MacArthur's forces had found other ways to provide air support. The whole operation was a mistake. A costly, bloody mistake. And Smith had tried to stop it. By early October, 3 weeks into the operation, the truth about Peleliu couldn't be hidden anymore. The Marines had suffered over 6,500 casualties, including over 1,200 killed. The 1st Marine Division was combat ineffective and had to be withdrawn for months of rebuilding. The 81st Infantry Division took over the fighting and spent another 2 months clearing the last Japanese positions. The battle didn't officially end until late November, over 2 months after it started. The final casualty count was staggering. Nearly 10,000 American casualties to capture an island 6 miles long. And for what? The airfield was barely used. The island contributed almost nothing to the Philippines invasion. It was exactly the pointless bloodbath Smith had said it would be. After Peleliu, Smith thought his career was over. He'd defied orders. He'd criticized his superiors publicly. He'd violated chain of command. He'd done everything a general wasn't supposed to do. He expected to be relieved and sent home in disgrace. Instead, something unexpected happened. The Marine Corps rallied around him. Junior officers who'd fought at Peleliu wrote letters supporting Smith. They said he'd been the only general who tried to protect them. That he'd fought against a bad plan while everyone else just followed orders. Enlisted Marines told reporters that Smith was the only general who seemed to care whether they lived or died. The press coverage was mixed. Some newspapers criticized Smith for insubordination. They said military discipline required following orders even when you disagreed. But other papers praised Smith as a hero. They said he'd tried to stop a disaster and had been ignored. They questioned why the officers who'd planned Peleliu weren't being held accountable for the casualties. The controversy reached Washington. Congress started asking questions about Peleliu. Why had casualties been so much higher than estimated? Why had the operation taken so much longer than planned? Who was responsible for the flawed planning? These questions made the Navy and Joint Chiefs uncomfortable. They didn't want a public investigation that would expose how badly the operation had been mismanaged. So instead of court-martialing Smith, they quietly shelved the issue. Smith kept his command. The officers he'd criticized were transferred to other positions without formal disciplinary action. The official line was that Peleliu had been a difficult but successful operation. Everyone had done their best under tough circumstances. Time to move on. But privately, things changed. The planning for future operations became more careful. Intelligence estimates were scrutinized more closely. Casualty projections were made more realistic. And importantly, field commanders like Smith were given more authority to modify operations based on actual conditions rather than being forced to stick to rigid plans made by staff officers far from the fighting. Smith's rebellion had exposed systemic problems in how the Pacific War was being run. Operations were being planned by officers who'd never seen combat. Intelligence was being filtered and sanitized before reaching decision-makers. Casualty estimates were lowered to make operations look more feasible. Timelines were compressed to make schedules work regardless of reality. And when operations went wrong, the officers who'd planned them blamed the troops or the field commanders rather than admitting their plans had been flawed. Peleliu forced the military to confront these problems. Not publicly. Not with formal investigations or accountability. But quietly, through changes in procedures and culture. Future operations in the Pacific were planned differently. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the last major amphibious operations of the war, had much more realistic planning. Casualty estimates were higher. Timelines were longer. Field commanders had more flexibility. These changes saved lives. Not in dramatic ways that make good stories, but in small ways that accumulated. Better planning meant fewer soldiers walking into impossible situations. More realistic timelines meant troops weren't rushed into attacks before they were ready. Greater field commander autonomy meant operations could be adjusted when plans didn't match reality. Smith didn't get credit for these changes. Officially, they just happened. But people in the know understood that Smith's stand at Peleliu had been the catalyst. His willingness to risk his career by telling the truth had forced the system to improve. Holland Smith continued to command Marine forces for the rest of the war. He oversaw the planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, though he didn't command on the ground for those operations. After the war ended, Smith retired with full honors. He was recognized as one of the fathers of modern amphibious warfare. His tactics and training methods became Marine Corps doctrine that's still taught today. But Smith's most important contribution wasn't tactical. It was moral. He proved that sometimes the right thing to do is refuse. To push back against orders you know are wrong. To fight for your men even when it costs you personally. To tell the truth even when the truth is unpopular and dangerous. Military culture emphasizes obedience. Following orders. Respecting the chain of command. These aren't bad things. They're necessary for military organizations to function. But they can be taken too far. When obedience becomes more important than results, when following orders matters more than accomplishing the mission or protecting your troops, something has gone wrong. Smith understood this. He knew when to obey and when to resist. He followed orders when they made sense. But when orders were stupid or wasteful of his Marines' lives, he fought back. He didn't do this recklessly. He didn't disobey every order he didn't like. He picked his battles carefully. And he was willing to pay the price for his decisions. The price could have been steep. Smith could have been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. He could have been publicly humiliated. His entire career could have been destroyed. He knew all this when he started his rebellion over Peleliu. He did it anyway because he thought it was right. That kind of moral courage is rare in any organization, but especially in the military where careers depend on not making waves. Most officers in Smith's position would have kept quiet. They would have followed orders, watched the disaster unfold, and then claimed afterward that they'd had concerns but were overruled. They would have protected themselves. Smith didn't protect himself. He fought. He made noise. He created problems for his superiors. He gave interviews saying the operation was a mistake. He violated chain of command. He did everything wrong according to military culture. And in doing so, he did everything right according to his conscience. The Marines who served under Smith never forgot this. Years after the war, veterans of Peleliu and other Pacific battles spoke about Smith with respect and affection. They called him Howling Mad Smith, but it wasn't mockery. It was recognition that his anger was righteous. That he was mad on their behalf. That he fought for them when nobody else would. Military historians debate Smith's actions. Some argue he should have been more diplomatic. That he could have achieved the same results without being so confrontational. That his personality made enemies unnecessarily. There's probably some truth to this. Smith wasn't a political general. He didn't know how to play the game. He just charged ahead with what he thought was right. But maybe that directness was necessary. Maybe diplomatic generals who tried to work within the system wouldn't have achieved anything. Maybe it took someone willing to blow everything up to force real change. We'll never know what would have happened if Smith had been more cautious. We only know what did happen. And what happened was that Peleliu forced the American military to improve its planning and decision-making processes. The tragedy is that these improvements came too late for the men who died on Peleliu. The improved planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa saved lives. But it didn't save the Marines who'd already been killed in a battle that should never have been fought. That's the brutal reality of war. Lessons are learned at the cost of lives. Systems improve only after failure. Progress comes through tragedy. Smith carried the weight of Peleliu for the rest of his life. He'd tried to stop the operation. He'd warned everyone. He'd been ignored. And then he'd watched his Marines die proving him right. That's not a satisfying victory. That's a nightmare. Knowing you were right doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't comfort their families. It doesn't make the loss acceptable. But Smith's actions did mean something. They meant that future operations were planned better. That future generals felt more empowered to question bad orders. That the system became slightly more responsive to reality and slightly less driven by wishful thinking and ego. That's not nothing. That's not glory or vindication. But it's something. It's lives saved that otherwise would have been lost. Holland Smith died in 1967 at the age of 84. His obituaries focused on his role in developing amphibious warfare tactics. On his commands during the Pacific War. On his contributions to Marine Corps doctrine. Most of the obituaries mentioned his nickname, Howling Mad Smith, as a colorful detail about his personality. Few of them captured what Smith's story really meant. That he was a general who cared more about his troops than his career. Who fought his own army to protect his men. Who risked everything to tell truths that powerful people didn't want to hear. Who proved that even in a rigid military hierarchy, individual conscience and courage still matter. That's the real story of Peleliu. Not the tactics or the fighting. But the general who tried to stop it. Who failed to prevent it but succeeded in forcing the system to learn from it. Who showed that sometimes the most important battles a general fights aren't against the enemy. They're against the flawed plans, the inflated egos, and the institutional inertia that gets soldiers killed unnecessarily. Holland Smith fought those battles. He didn't always win. But he fought. And in fighting, he made the system better. He saved lives that came after even though he couldn't save the ones that came before. That's a complicated, imperfect legacy. But it's an important one. It's a reminder that even in the most hierarchical organizations, individuals can still make a difference by refusing to go along with things they know are wrong. The next video has another story about courage nobody talks about.